Hey everyone, it's Dr. Amelia Kelley, the host of The Sensitivity Doctor, and I'm here today to have a one-on-one chat with all of you. I've been getting some really awesome questions through Messenger from clients and just readers that reach out, and I thought, what better way to answer those questions than in a podcast episode? So as far as the questions go, a lot of them had to do with gaslighting and highly sensitive folks. So those are going to be the things that I'm going to be chatting about the most, maybe even some personal questions. So I've got them listed over here. So let's dig in. Okay, so the first question I got, is it possible to be highly sensitive and have trauma? Or is my sensitivity just a response to what I've been through? Okay. I love this question for lots of reasons, but one of them being my take on sensitivity. When I think about sensitivity, and I've explored this with some folks that I work with, and also it has a lot to do with really what is driving my passion for this podcast and something I hope to be writing about soon, is our idea around sensitivity. So we know from Dr. Aaron's work and from work done on, babies decades ago, with sensitive nervous systems, that some people are just born with much more sensitive nervous systems. And this is, it's genetic, it's from birth. And it's funny because when we think about kids, when we think about babies, the really fussy ones are actually the ones that I kind of joke, if I have a friend who has a really fussy baby, I'm like, oh, it's okay. They'll be the easier, calmer toddlers. While there's external factors like environment and things like that, when you look at the way sensitivity works, this is often true because those kids are going to be the ones who aren't going to need as much stimulation to feel as satisfied, to feel as centered. They're going to appear a bit more, as we sometimes say, introverted or more laid back because they don't need as much input. So when we look at sensitivity in that way, there is absolutely a genetic component that is going to be present from the very start of life. I would go so far as to say it'd be really neat if someday we could start exploring in utero how sensitivity shows up, but that's a whole different conversation. The thing about trauma, and what I love about this question, you guys are going to see me if you're watching, I'm kind of scrolling back and forth from these questions, is that trauma also can cause sensitivity. And I've seen this honestly myself. So not just with my clients, but I've mentioned on the podcast before that my husband had been in a pretty serious car accident years ago. And it's interesting because before the accident, I had learned about HSPs and I was curious. And of course, I'm asking, everyone I know and love, what do you think? Are you an HSP? Having them take the scale. And so I had him take the scale. Now, mind you, research shows that men do tend to score themselves a little bit lower than women, even if they should be scoring higher. And what they believe this is attributed to has a lot to do with culture and belief systems around sensitivity and this idea of masculinity, which, maybe I'll unpack today, or maybe we won't dig too deep into that. If you want to learn more about that and dive into that, I really love the episode with Zach Beach that Jean and I had done kind of at the beginning of the Sensitivity Doctors. That was a good one. He actually didn't realize he was an HSP until he was on the show, so that was kind of fun to unveil. But he took the test, and I think he got an 8. And this is the traditional, Dr. Aaron test that I believe had about 26 questions or so. And if you reach 14, you're considered an HSP. So 8, doesn't sound that close. If you consider that men score a little lower than they really are, I was thinking, okay, he's at least a moderately sensitive person. Well, I had him retest just recently, about a year or so ago, since the accident, which did cause a traumatic brain injury. Lo and behold, he scored like an 18. Okay, I believe him too, but I've seen this. His sensitivity is so much more intense than it was before the accident. So this is a medical trauma that I'm talking about. But when we consider the fact that trauma in general, especially really intense acute trauma that can impact the body and the nervous system, and also complex trauma that over time has an impact on our brain structure, it actually makes it where The areas of the brain that in HSPs are more active, which are all the interesting compartments in the amygdala and the fear center and the emotion processing centers, those areas of the brain also become more active when you've endured trauma, especially over time. Because when we think about, the brain is going to prioritize what it needs to prioritize in order to survive. So the parts of the brain that have to do with higher order logic, or I've said on other episodes, things like creativity or self-compassion, the pathways connected to that aren't going to keep you safe if you're in a highly abusive or dysfunctional family or situation, or you're in, war, if we want to go kind of dramatic to one end, or you're in a situation where your body and your mind and your brain are in a threat point. It wouldn't make sense to write poetry in the middle of a bombing. I know that's a dramatic example, but likewise, it wouldn't make sense to sit down and do something so expressive, creative, and empathic and compassionate when you're trying to survive abuse. Even though these are beautiful things that I think are a big part of the healing process of abuse and of trauma. So the answer, here's my long-winded answer, of course. The very simplified answer, is it possible to be an HSP and have trauma, or is my sensitivity just a response to what I've been through? The answer is yes. It is possible to have both. To be just an HSP and also to also have trauma have that impact. What I often tell people to look at is the history, the etiology behind something. Was this a way that you felt for a long time, or was this more so after the trauma? Now, when I consider my husband genetically, I wouldn't have said he is biologically an HSP, but life and trauma has thrown his brain into a circumstance where he is now a highly sensitive person, which that would be an interesting episode to explore. What is it like when you go into a relationship as an HSP with a moderately sensitive person, and then suddenly you're both HSPs? It's an interesting thing to adjust to. But trauma can be also more impactful for the HSP brain, because as we know, HSPs absorb their environment so much more intensely for the good or the bad. And I think some of the work on the orchids versus dandelion is a really great place to start to look into that. So yeah, oh my gosh, you guys, I'm not going to get through all 10 questions. This is ridiculous. Okay, next one. Oh, okay, we're jumping to a different topic, to gaslighting. How do I know if I'm being gaslit or just overthinking everything that people keep telling me? Okay, I really love this question because I think it's really helpful and applicable to highly sensitive people. Because as we know, HSPs are more prone to depthful thought. There's an article that I had written a while ago for the Highly Sensitive Refuge, trying to piece apart the complexities of the differences between autism and high sensitivity. And I will say that is such a huge animal to try to approach and piece apart. But one part of that I found so much supporting research on was the difference in the HSP brain when it came to depth of processing, not necessarily breadth of processing where you're expanding to various things. And that's why when the HSP brain is at its best, it's able to go deep. It's able to dive right into something and remain there until you feel like you have processed the nooks and crannies of something, and you can walk out feeling so much more clear, grounded, and really in touch with your authentic self. When you have too much to process, though, when you're being demanded to process things like external stimuli, stress at work, or the thoughts and opinions of other people, you're not able to settle into that comfy place that the HSP brain likes to be, where you get to deeply think about something. Instead, you're demanded to spread your awareness so much further, which is really taxing and can increase anxiety. So what we know about gaslighting is that when you experience gaslighting, oh boy, gaslighting, it's like its whole other animal. The feeling, at least what I could say, and I mean, I've experienced gaslighting as well. I don't really know anyone who has never experienced it, but to me, it's kind of like when you look at trauma. All of us have experienced trauma to some degree. But how often, how intense, how much does it impact your ideas and your perceptions of the world, your ego strength, your ability to connect with yourself? That's what usually determines if someone suffers with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. I think of it the same way with gaslighting. Most of us have been gaslit some form or another. I mean, if you turn the news on and there's a politician standing there, you are probably experiencing some globalized form of gaslighting. But when the gaslighting is pervasive or it's coming from a really trusted source, or you are vulnerable to this person or this entity in any way, and I say entity because it could also be if, say, you are at work and this is a job you love and you're experiencing gaslighting, and to shine a light on it could put you in jeopardy. Or it could also be marginalized groups, or if you're going to the only doctor in town and they're saying something and you just know it's not true in your heart. There's all these moments where power dynamics play a role. So getting back to the original question again, and you guys, this is totally how an HSP would answer a question. It's like I have to read the question, unpack it into so many different compartments, and then come back to the question. So how to know if you're being gaslit or just overthinking? I think the main distinguisher between the two is where I was naturally going to go to when I was kind of unpacking this question, is the destabilizing feeling that gaslighting can cause. Where I know when I have experienced it, it's like I feel as this flush in my body where I just, I get high, I get kind of, it's almost like a fight flight response to something because it feels so out of the norm and it can feel so jarring. Now, if we go back to the traumatized body though, if you have experienced pervasive trauma, your kind of response, your signal that something is off might need more input for you to get the same like glaring red flag feeling. But I think when it comes to gaslighting, if you're feeling off center, confused, you don't know up from down, that's a good indicator it's gaslighting. Whereas with overthinking, I think with overthinking, there's a lot of recycling the same thoughts. There is this very internalized experience. It's tiring. So is the experience of being gaslit. But, with overthinking, there's often also repetitive, recycled thoughts. But let's consider this. If you're an HSP or you're an empath or you're just someone who's experienced trauma or you're deeply, honestly, if you have a really high IQ, which I would go so far as to say is its own form of neurodiversity, because let's be honest, guys, neurodiversity, if we have the center point of norm, anything that falls off that central line can be seen as a diversity, but we'll see if we even dig into that more today. But when you consider the fact that being gaslit can cause you to overthink, and then you have the HSP brain that's going to dig into the depth so much more, it makes the gaslighting more effective because the more we're overthinking, the more destabilized we can feel. So yeah, I think the destabilizing feeling is the big one. Okay, question number 3. Why do I sometimes miss the people who hurt me the most? Oh, that's like such an honest question. Thank you for asking that. So there's 2 things that I would really lean into when it comes to that. Number 1 is intermittent reward, and number 2 is something called euphoric recall. So intermittent reward really speaks to the way that our nervous system responds when something is not consistent. And when we think about this, I often bring up the idea of a slot machine. When you are gambling, let's channel you to Vegas or wherever, the way that they get you to keep coming back for more is the off chance that maybe, just maybe, you're going to win. That can happen also when it comes to people who don't always give you what you deserve. Okay, so when we really think about the nature of a trauma bond or a trauma cycle, so the trauma bond happening within the trauma cycle of abuse, the cycle of abuse itself, it really starts with the outburst. And then we have this moment after, maybe not immediately after, but sometime after, where there's repair. And the repair that happens after a non-abusive relationship really should be where we are taking ownership. We are sharing our real thoughts and feelings. We're trying to make true change. And our actions match our words. But if you're in an abuse cycle, that repair period, it's smoke and mirrors, honestly. There's really no true way of knowing if the person really means what they say, because shortly after, tensions will start to rise again. And then we get close and then we've got the outburst. Okay. So that period of time, that intermittent reward of the promises, the potential love bombing, maybe, being showered with flowers or gifts. Or I've had a client once before who was saying that they know that they're in what some say hoovering, like being pulled back into an abusive situation, when the person that they're in a partnership with suddenly, who is usually really opinionated, becomes really docile and really agreeable and becomes fawning. And they will fawn and become just overly amendable, which is not their true nature. So if you feel like there's this level of inauthenticity, that's usually love bombing to some extent. So when we consider the fact that feeling, being rewarded at periods of time that are unpredictable, release more dopamine in the body and the brain. They release more chemicals that allow us to think that we are onto something, that this is going to get better, that things are going to improve. That is actually more rewarding than consistent, stable connection. And that's so tricky. And I really wish I could just dig into why that is the case for us, because it doesn't seem good evolutionarily if you think about it. But in a way, it points to the fact that our brains are created to notice novelty. And novelty keeps us on our toes and it keeps us engaged. So that's one part of why you might find yourself, just getting sucked back into those cycles. So I think removing yourself from that moment where that person can use things like love bombing and empty promises and repair methods that are not true repair methods, that's where you get pulled out of the cycle. I think a lot of people think that you're supposed to pull yourself out of the cycle when things get bad. That's actually when you're less likely to pull yourself out of the cycle. You are more likely to fully remove yourself from the cycle if you pull out at the moments that they're trying to repair, which is really hard, and it seems kind of opposite of what you would imagine would be the path you would take. The other part I was saying was euphoric recall. So we have a tendency, and a lot of us call this nostalgia, where when we look at something historically, we tend to look at the more positive parts of it and just kind of conveniently remember those parts and not the parts that were more painful. I mean, if anyone has ever had more than one baby, you know what I'm talking about. This can happen a lot in romantic relationships, and not just romantic relationships, all different types of intimate relationships. So it could be, with a toxic parent, or if you're a parent with a toxic adult child that you're trying to cut ties with, or a coworker. I mean, really anyone, guys. It doesn't have to be a specific person. But what happens is that we will start to reflect on the positives, and not because it just is helpful or healthy or we want to think positively. No, it's actually going back to that neurochemical dopamine I was talking about before. We get more release of dopamine when we think about things like that through euphoric recall lens, where we think of the positives and not the negatives. So of course, if we're not being mindful about it, we're going to be more likely to slip into euphoric recall versus factual recall. So what I would encourage you to do with this is, if you find yourself being pulled back in by the intermittent reward, and we haven't even talked about all the stressors that pull people back, things like money, children, power dynamics, safety, culture, religion, family expectations. I mean, that's just a whole nother structure that can keep us going back for more. But today I really wanted to approach the two things that you can really control. And by control, I mean you can consciously do something. So with euphoric recall, you can make a choice and you can make a decision to, I would recommend, jot down the things that are the true truth. Write down your true truths about that relationship. And then when you find yourself slipping into euphoric recall thinking, catch it, notice it, understand that it feels neurochemically positive. So that's most likely why you're doing it. And then go back and read what you had written. And this can also help to find like a support person, a friend, a loved one that you can say, okay, I have a tendency to romanticize this past relationship and it's leading me to go back for these intimate rewards. You're probably not going to say it like that. Maybe a little less nerdy than that. But ask them, this person, can you remind me to look at my list? Or can you remind me of the true truths that I have shared with you? Okay. So let's see. Next we have, can being a highly sensitive person make someone more likely to attract narcissists? 1000%. Just 1000%, which is so unfair and terrible. The reason is the very nature of HSPs. We tend to be, and just people who consider themselves to be empaths, but also this lends to that whole trauma versus HSP piece. Someone who has experienced trauma can be very deeply impacted by other people's emotions because you might have spent a good portion of your childhood or your history being hyper tuned into people's emotions because of the fact that that was part of your survival and that was a skill that kept you safe. So even if you're not necessarily an HSP by birth, both those folks, an HSP, a traumatized individual, and or someone who is highly sensitive and experienced trauma, your hypersensitivity and your tendency to feel out the room and be able to adjust things. I love in the original Dr. Aaron questionnaire where it was like, do you know what to do in the environment to make people comfortable? Things like adjusting the light or changing the scent of the room. That's such this tangible way of exploring and expressing how HSPs tend to experience people's emotions because we can almost literally quite touch and feel them as well. And this is true also when you look at inflammation in the highly sensitive body, what happens when you are around someone who is deeply troubled or struggling. And, if you look in my therapy room, I don't know if my clients are probably so used to it, but there's some rooms in my office. There's about 10 therapists that work with me, and some of their offices are quite cozy, I will say, and they're like really close to their clients. I guess this is kind of a perk of owning the place, but my office is bigger and I have us quite spread out. And we have, like this nice coffee table and all these fidgets and fun things that can play with in between us. Part of that is just because of the space, but part of that is that energetic space that is sometimes needed when you're around people's pain as a highly sensitive person so that you can stay within your energy to be present for it. So what happens when that energy is a narcissistic energy? Narcissists are looking for their narcissistic supply, as we know. And what better supply than someone who gets it, someone who knows how they feel, someone who knows how to adjust their behavior to accommodate, someone who is so much more deeply concerned about your feelings than maybe the average person. So I really, really advise you, if you are listening to this and you are in a relationship with a narcissist, know that there is no level of empathy or support or insight or adjusting that you can do that is going to stop them from their narcissistic behavior. Because by the very nature of what you have to offer them, they are receiving the supply that they need. And the only way to stop this, just like I was saying with the cycle of abuse, where you pull yourself out at the point that feels good, is to pull yourself out at the point that feels good. And I know that sounds really hard, but I promise you that that is the easiest point to pull out of that narcissistic supply cycle because of the fact that in those moments, gosh, what they're getting from you is so rewarding that it's quite nearly impossible that they're going to have any insight or cut ties or break or, set you free, so to speak. So 1000%, if you are highly sensitive, you will be more likely to be appealing. I don't want to say targeted, but appealing to a narcissist. So I would recommend, there's a really great book by Shahida Arabi. I'm trying to find it. It's the book for highly sensitive people and how they can deal with toxic personalities. I love, love, love that book. And I think it's at my other office. Otherwise, I would hold it up and tell you the exact subtitle. But I would highly recommend it. Her work is awesome. Hi, Shahida. Thank you for your endorsements on some of my books. Okay, so let's see. If I grew up masking my sensitivity, how do I even know who I really am now? Ooh, deep. Let's see if I can answer that in a couple questions. When I think about the highly sensitive person, And this is actually a nice segue from the last question about narcissists. I think about the fact that because we are so adaptable to people's emotions and because we know how to adjust and kind of mold into what other people need, it is so much more important that we learn boundary setting early on in order to help us sustain that contact with our unique, amazing self. Because, I think about being a teenager, just being a teenager in itself. I don't know about you, but I'm impressed with anyone who kind of like knew what they wanted to do for a living from an early age or just holistically seemed similar all through their teen years. I feel like I tried on every personality and persona for a couple of years, just like, does this work? Does this work? How's this fit? What is this like? And a lot of times it was centered around who I was hanging out with and if I liked them, if I thought they were cool, if I admired them. So I think when it comes to knowing who you really are, first of all, that is a question that I really struggle with. A lot of my clients will say, I don't know who I am. And they'll often say this if they've experienced gaslighting or if they're in an unhealthy relationship or things like that. I think quantifying who am I is such an impossible question. I love Ram Dass has this amazing documentary. He's now passed called Becoming Nobody. I love it so much. If any of you are interested, I would recommend checking it out. And it's this letting go of this idea of being someone or somebody. I think in this industry, like in mental health and self-help, there's this intense focus on finding out who you really are. I think instead of that question, because to me that just feels so big and almost difficult to answer, I think I like to instead connect with what feels comfortable and authentic in my body. Like if what I'm doing makes me feel soft around the edges and calms my breath and I feel like a settling in my nervous system, I know I'm on the right track and I'm leading towards what's authentic for me. But if what I'm doing is causing tension or dis-ease or disease or, affecting my sleep, or I'm saying and doing things that feel they don't feel good in my body, like even coming out of my mouth, it just doesn't feel honest. That's usually to me a good indicator that maybe I am, to the point of the original question, masking. And so I've talked about masking briefly, on some social media posts, and I had an awesome conversation with Jessica Graham on this. When it comes to masking, it's a set of behaviors that we do in order to fit in, quite simply. But it's more so common with someone who is neurodiverse or has things that are kind of unique or outside the norm of their tribe, basically, or the people that are around them. And so it might be something as simple as, not speaking as loudly or not knocking your leg around or not saying how you really feel because you feel like it's not going to be accepted in a certain group or setting. These are masking behaviors that, to the point of the original question, if you're an HSP and you're moving through life in a way where you are constantly adjusting to other people, the mask is going to be so present that you almost stop feeling it. And what I would encourage you to do then, like I was saying before, is connect back with your body and ask your body if what it's feeling and what you're noticing is comforting and soft around the edges, or is there tension and a feeling of dis-ease in your body. I think our bodies send us a lot more signals as a highly sensitive person than the neuronormative person. And this is where our HSP trait really works for us. I've noticed with my HSPs, when they're doing something that doesn't feel authentic to them, their anxiety ramps up, their pain ramps up, their ability to sleep ramps up. So this is where our sensitivity becomes this really beautiful barometer for what we're really feeling. So I would encourage you to feel the discomfort and see if you adjust what you're doing, what that feels like instead. And let's just get rid of this "who am I really" question. I mean, I know there's some really great, like How to Meet Yourself is a very popular one by the holistic psychologist. I know a couple of my clients have really enjoyed doing that kind of work. But I think a big part of that is like, let's stop making it about answering the big existential who am I question and more about just be present with yourself. So, guys, I am not going to get through all 10 questions. This might have to be a two-parter. How do I stop second guessing myself in a relationship after gaslighting? So, shameless plug, I did write a pretty extensive step-by-step guide on this in Psychology Today. You could look it up on my blog in your corner. But I'll just really briefly say with regard to that, anything that can reconnect you with your inner voice is going to be powerful. So this means surrounding yourself with people who celebrate your voice. This means doing things, whatever you like, that amplifies that voice. So for some people, it's journaling. For other people, it's probably podcasting, honestly. Like I think about the Adult Child Pod. If any of you guys have watched it or seen it, I've been on it before. I mean, that podcast is all about finding your authentic voice after experiencing something, like gaslighting, or just finding that ability to connect with your inner voice in general. It could also be things like trying to reflect back on things you enjoyed and wanted before the gaslighting and then engaging in those things. It sounds overly simple, but doing things that you like to do as a child, like playing or relaxing. I think we sometimes forget that rest is where we find a lot of our voice. And, there's this tendency when you are neurodiverse, I find. I had a really cool thing happen with one of my books the other day. I was really excited. I posted about it. And then I had this one part of me, this one voice that was thinking, okay, what do I have to do next? What articles do I need to write? What's next on my list? And then this other part, this kind of more connected, grounded part said, wait a minute, just sit for a moment and enjoy this. Just enjoy it for a moment. And I feel like after gaslighting, there can be a tendency to want to be in flight mode a lot, because when you're gaslit, there's this need to justify and kind of speak your truth to the person who won't hear your truth. So it can feel like you're running on a treadmill going nowhere. Try to stop the treadmill. Try to slow down and connect with your inner voice and make sure the people around you support that as well. Okay. Do you believe trauma is ever fully healed, or do we just learn to live alongside it? That's a great question. I believe that honestly, I believe none of us are fully healed. I know that might sound a little dramatic, but I think the true nature of being a human exposes us to suffering. And suffering is part of the journey. But I do believe that we can experience, I've heard this term before, like ego death. Like you can experience these kind of little moments where parts of you can be healed and then they get to rest. I don't want to say they die off. That sounds really dramatic, but I feel like there's these moments where parts of us, as they heal and they rest, other parts can come through. And so absolutely do I believe that you can experience dramatic, incredible healing as you have gone through life after trauma. 1,000%. Do I believe it's an on-off switch? It's just gone? It's part of the fabric. It's part of your story. I think integrating your trauma into your story, trauma is part of why I'm sitting here talking to all of you. If we honor that and allow it to integrate into our story, it just carries a totally different energy, and it doesn't feel like something we have to check off a to-do list. And I really do encourage some of my clients who come in to work on their trauma. They can sometimes come in guns blazing like, okay, let's do this trauma work. And I'll say, even just being here is trauma work. Even just building relationship is trauma work. So slowing down a bit. I remember actually, if you read What I Wish I Knew that I co-wrote with Kendall Ann, she had talked about where she was measuring the healing of her bruises, and that once her bruises were healed, she was going to tell herself she was fine. She was going to move past the attack from her ex. And she found out quickly that it was just one chapter in the story. So do I believe in extreme, amazing healing? Absolutely. Do I believe it's an on-off switch? No. Okay, so now I have a question someone asked of me personally, which was, what was it like for me for you. What was it like for me when I found out I was highly sensitive, and did it change any of my ideas about my history? Okay, I love this question because it makes me think about when I bring up sensitivity to some of my clients and they kind of, not everyone, but I have heard a little bit of a grumble of like, "Oh, I don't want another diagnosis." First and foremost, we know it's not a medical diagnosis, it's a state trait. And for me, it brought hindsight, right? So able to look back on beliefs that I had about myself and realize that I don't have an issue with anger, or I'm not hard to please, or I'm not never going to be satisfied. Instead, the moments of anger had a lot to do with my nervous system being overreactive, or the feelings of not being satisfied had a lot to do with my deep passion as a highly sensitive person and wanting to strive and explore and do more and feel that moral pull to help people. So I think for me, understanding what it is helps to like pull it apart, not have you be enmeshed with what high sensitivity can do in your life and do to you, but instead it gives you this vantage point. I think also it informs my ability to be a mom, to be completely honest, because as a mom, a highly sensitive working mom with, I believe, most likely sensitive children, which there's some scales on that, but I believe both my kids have some sensitivities as well, which is common because it's genetic. It allows me to have compassionate language to share with them when I need a break or I've had too much. So it makes it where I'm not making it about other people, but I'm reflecting on my own nervous system. So I think that can be really helpful and healing for our relationships if we would allow all of us to check in on how sensitive we really are. Because as I've mentioned, the science points to this not being black or white either. We aren't just highly sensitive or not sensitive. There are people who are moderately, more lower sensitive, more highly sensitive, which I plan on continuing to explore in my work in the future that I'm excited to share with all of you, hopefully. Okay, so let's see if I can do the last two fairly quickly. How do I explain being an HSP to someone without sounding dramatic or fragile? Okay, well, first of all, what I like about this is I was talking about the high sensitivity trait with someone a while back, and her perspective was almost that it was kind of this more soft, meek trait. And I think that's because sometimes people who are highly sensitive aren't going to be the loudest person in the room, or because they might hang back in certain situations. But in actuality, I see it as this intensely passionate, intensified version of living, that there's so much more happening internally than people even see. And to the goodness of this too, things like food can taste better, music can move you more deeply, love can feel stronger. But obviously we also know that any sensory input, you feel more. So this can be things like how medication affects you, how caffeine affects you, how lack of sleep affects you, how people's mood can affect you. So I think just the quick and gritty way I would explain it to someone, if they said, what does it mean to be highly sensitive? I would say, well, based on all animal species, we found that there's 20 to 30%, and the range is pretty wide for a variety of reasons, of people, so we're talking about highly sensitive people, who are highly sensitive, meaning that they are genetically born with a more hyperactive or more active limbic system, including the amygdala, which is the fear center, as well as areas of the brain that are designed for mirroring emotions and planning around people's feelings and emotions. And while this can prove to be challenging at times and maybe lead to exhaustion or overwhelm, gosh, does it make life beautiful. And if you want to learn more about what that is like for me, I'm happy to tell you. And so that's kind of what I would say to someone. I don't think of it as fragile, definitely not dramatic. However, I would say this. It's not something that I think our society has looked at in a way that built it up like it should be, to the point that I was saying that I think we sometimes think of sensitivity as a fragility, when in actuality, it's the opposite. So if the person you're speaking to sees it that way, they see it as a fragility, it may mean that they feel uncomfortable with their own sensitivity, or that they've been cultured to feel that way. So while having these conversations are awesome, you don't need to validate yourself. Just remember, you do not have to validate your sensitivity to anyone, but it's a journey that may lead you to other HSPs or other people who do want to learn about it just quite naturally. So, okay, last question. I got through that. That was fun though, you guys. Feel free to send questions anytime. What's something you wish more therapists understood about working with HSPs and neurodivergent clients? There's so many things, but I think the biggest thing that I want people to understand is the importance of piecing apart the difference between mental health disorders, trauma, and HSP traits and other forms of neurodiversity. I think a lot of people get misdiagnosed and sometimes even mismedicated. Coming in on, I had one client who came in on just a full-on cocktail of meds. And while I am a strong supporter of whatever, type of medical interventions work best for you, for her, it was doing more harm than good. So not only did we identify her sensitivity, but she got linked up with a functional doctor who was able to take a holistic look at what she was on, do what's called a med wash for some of the meds that were not helping her based on her nervous system. And to this day, she is at a much more level, balanced state, and I think just doing so much better. And I think it's because instead of covering up sensitivity with the medicine, she is living a life that balances her sensitivity more, which caused her to need less medications. So I really think sensitivity is something that should be discussed in school. Honestly, it should be something that we're all educated on before we even go into the field. We're encouraged when we're diagnosing to rule out medical conditions and medical issues. So while this is not a medical condition, it is a state trait. And I do think it's something good for up and coming therapists to know what it is so that they can check, is this person having a flight of ideas because they have anxiety, or is it because they have ADHD, or is it because their depth of processing from being highly sensitive? I mean, there's so many options. So all right. Well, that was fun. Hopefully I can do that again sometime. Just got to wait to have those questions come back in. But if there were any questions I did not answer that you really hoped I would get to, feel free to send them back to my message or go ahead and email me. If there was anything I was answering that you want to learn more about, feel free to reach out. I just want to extend such a level of appreciation for all of you that have been listening and on this journey of empowerment and just really advocating for neurodiversity and those who are healing from trauma and finding their voice. I'm just so honored to be part of your life in any way and am so open to you reaching out and asking questions and just making this a journey together. Have a great rest of your day, your evening, wherever and whenever you are listening, and be well, everyone.